Hey kids, welcome back to Rob's Red Hotspot, my tutorial series on Hearts of Iron 3, their finest hour. Last episode we talked about division composition and unit statistics and all that. Realized that was a 1.5 hour video. I know some of these videos are long, but you know, it's hard enough to condense all this information, and if you guys are finding it hard to watch the whole video, which I wouldn't be surprised, there are always links in the description, timestamps in the description, and with YouTube's new feature, you can actually scroll along the bottom bar in your YouTube video and select. They're called chapters now, so you can fairly easily kind of click around and look at different topics you're interested in. I just you know, I don't think I can condense the information much more. This video should be shorter, however, because we are going to talk about air and naval units to kind of follow up on production. So I'm going to once again select the dreadful 1944 scenario, just so that we can look at all the different unit types. Let's load up Germany to start, and we may end up loading up maybe USA or something to look at some of the naval units. But let's start with the air units. One thing I would say generally is that in this game, land units are a little bit more developed than air and naval units, and land combat is a lot more complex than air and naval combat. I very much enjoy the air and naval combat in this game, though, so I still think it's really worth investing in, and you do need to do a certain amount of it to succeed. So let's start out by going into our air wing view here. And yeah, I think Germany has every type of plane pretty much. Yeah, okay, so that's good. So let's start talking about air units in general. First of all, if we look on the map, let's find an air unit on the map. Basically, when we looked at land units, this bar here in land units indicated a brigade, and in some ways you can think of this air unit as a sort of air brigade, if you wish. It might be a wing or a group, depending on whether you're using the RAF or the U.S. Air Force organization and terminology, but it doesn't really matter. These, generally speaking, these represent, give or take, 1,000 aircrew, aviators, and all that. So it's not an individual plane. It's a group, a grouping of planes. And if you add several planes to a stack like this, you could consider it like an air division, or an air command or something, depending on what terminology and what country you're using. So yeah, and generally we create stacks of these, and I'll talk about what kinds of stacks that you would want to create in your Air Force, generally speaking. But let's start just like we did for land units. Let's start by going through the different categories of air units and some of their statistics. So we can see here, I would say that there's a few different ways to categorize air units. Well, first of all, there are fighters and bombers, as well as transport planes. And so fighters are what you use to defend your airspace or establish air superiority over enemy airspace. And generally speaking, they are going to fight enemy planes. Bombers are used to hit land targets or sea targets, generally. And there are different types of bombers and different types of fighters in the game. So the other way that you can categorize aircraft is you've got basically three, or I guess if we're including rockets, you've got four categories of aircraft. You have light aircraft, medium aircraft, and heavy aircraft. So light aircraft, medium aircraft, and heavy aircraft. And that has to do with practicals, and I will be talking more about practicals soon. I didn't talk much about them last episode, but because there was just so much to cover, but we will be talking about practicals and production soon. And then you would have rockets. Sorry, that would be the fourth category if you want to categorize them that way. Let's do a quick overview of the different unit types. Interceptors are your frontline fighters. They are the fighters that you will be using to defend your territory. They are the best units in the game at attacking other aircraft. So they will tend to win air battles with any other unit type here. Pretty much, with maybe a few exceptions, and that depends obviously on your technology, but generally speaking, your interceptors are your best bet for defending your territory. Multi-role are a light aircraft fighter type plane. They actually, if you look at in the stats, when you see INT, when you're looking at technologies and stats and stuff, that indicates an interceptor. Multi-role is actually FTR for fighter. That's a bit misleading. Multi-role fighters are, well, first of all, they're longer range interceptors, so they can potentially escort bombers, because bombers tend to have a longer mission range than fighters. Bombers tend to have a longer mission range than interceptors. So multi-roles can potentially escort bombers. They also can be used for certain light bombing tasks. So they're kind of a versatile plane that has a longer range. They are, however, not as good in combat as interceptors. So generally speaking, when an interceptor fights a multi-role, the interceptor is going to win. Multi-roles, however, do have a longer range, so they are useful in areas where interceptors won't be able to get. So for example, I use multi-roles a lot to defend my ships. If I'm playing, say, as the United Kingdom, I'll set up multi-roles to patrol over the North Sea, because out here, especially in the early game, German interceptors can't make it out here. So my multi-roles are going to be fighting planes, naval bombers, and other multi-roles basically, and they're going to be fighting planes that are, that they're able to compete against. The carrier air group is what you load onto your aircraft carriers if you have aircraft carriers. The carrier air group is actually a combination of fighters and bombers. That's why there's two little logos here. That's realistic in the sense that aircraft carriers would be equipped with a variety of different types of planes. They would have, an interceptor type fighter that would defend the aircraft carrier or shoot down enemy planes. They would have a naval bomber. They might have things like float planes and scout planes that would scout out the enemy. They might even have things like flying boats on them, or even in some cases they would carry heavier strategic bombers that would be used for bombing Japan and things like that, the Americans. Anyway, so just keep in mind that the carrier air group is modeled as a mix. It's as different types of planes, generally light aircraft. They use the light aircraft practical. Carrier air groups are fairly versatile. They are weaker than interceptors or multi-roles, so they will tend to lose air battles against land-based interceptor type fighters. But they're able to defeat bombers. They're basically there to fight other aircraft carriers, defend your ships from bombing, and they can also do certain types of bombing tasks, like even ground attacks and naval strikes and port strikes and things like that. They're not the best at anything they do, but they can be deployed from ships, which means you can use them way out in the middle of the ocean or in remote areas, and they can sort of do a decent job of everything. You're going to end up using carrier air groups primarily to establish naval domination. If you approach land, once you approach land targets, they lose their effectiveness. So, aircraft carriers are going to be not super effective if you're playing as the Allies, for example, along the coast of Germany, because you're going to be getting hit by a lot of land-based aircrafts. and so your carrier air groups are going to be quickly losing their strength. They're not quite as bad in the Mediterranean because Italy's air force tends to be a lot weaker than Germany's. They're very strong in these remote areas of the Pacific where Japan is unlikely to be able to deploy huge numbers of land-based fighters. So that's just something to keep in mind. Basically to reiterate, interceptors beat multi-roles, multi-roles beat carrier air groups in terms of the outcome of air combat. Rocket interceptors are a kind of a red herring unit. They represent a step in the process in terms of making jet fighters. So you can see, let's just take a look at their stats here quickly. They're weaker than either multi-roles or interceptors. They are, however, very, very fast. I'm going to pop quickly into the air technology screen here. Rocket, I would pretty much not recommend building rocket interceptors at all, and unless you just want to get some, I guess, I think is it rocket? I think it's jet engine practical. They're basically an experimental weapon, and in the war they were not very, they were not. They were not very successful, and they were not widely used. When you research the jet engine tech, you will your interceptors, if we look at this tech here, and I haven't talked much about technology, I'll be doing a whole video on that, but all of these air units, these standard air units, will be receiving upgrades. So huge speed upgrades, and I guess you get air defense upgrades at the cost of range. You're trading speed for range in general. Their jet planes are modeled in the game, but they don't actually have a unit in this interface. So rocket interceptors, generally speaking, if you want to build them to roleplay, by all means, but they're not particularly useful, and some of the units in this game are kind of red herrings, right? Because the game follows history, so it's not like a Civilization type game where every unit's supposed to be balanced in a kind of rock paper scissors kind of way. There are units that reflect history, things like battle cruisers and super heavy battleships and stuff that some countries spent a lot of resources developing, but that actually didn't end up turning out being all that useful. Let's now look at your bombers. So there is a light aircraft type of bomber called close air supports. That's your Stukas. There's your Stukas if you're the Germans, and these are ground attack fighters that are designed to support your army, and they are very short-range bombers. Now, they're particularly good at hitting hard targets. They have a high hard attack statistic. They're particularly good at hitting tanks. And they're also fairly cheap to build. So it's something that Germany, for example, it can field a lot of them early on. The Soviet Union may want to use them and the Soviet Union did actually use the IL-2 Sturmovik, after which there is that fantastic flight simulator named. The IL-2 Sturmovik close air support bomber was a fantastic light close air support bomber. But yeah, they're particularly good at hitting hard targets like armor in particular. They can also be used as short-range naval bombers. Tactical bombers are generally going to be a much stronger bomber. They have a much wider range. Their range is similar to multi-role fighters, and they are particularly good at hitting soft targets, and they have a decent strategic attack in terms of actually damaging provinces and infrastructure and stuff like that. But their real specialty is hitting soft targets. And as I mentioned in the video on division composition, where I talked about why artillery tends to be preferred over anti-tanks, there are more soft targets in the game than there are hard targets. So close air support might be useful especially if you're a country that can't field a lot of tanks and tank destroyers and things like that. But tactical bombers for most countries are going to actually be able to do more damage to the enemy as your bomber techs get better. Close air support might be a good substitute for countries that just don't have tanks. Or can't field very many tanks. They might be able to do some damage to the enemy's armored columns, so that your infantry doesn't get quite as bogged down when facing armored opponents. Naval bombers. Naval bombers are another medium type bomber. Twin engine, by the way. When we talk about medium aircraft, we're really talking about twin engine. So that would be an aircraft with let's click this one here. An aircraft with with an engine on either wing, as opposed to an aircraft with just the single engine fighter. So naval bombers are a specialized type of tactical bomber that is used for long range naval strikes, port strikes. They're just specialized at hitting shipping. And so these are very, very useful in certain circumstances. They're good at convoy raiding, especially as radar technology gets better. Naval bombers will actually start to replace or be better than ships at destroying submarines, hitting enemy convoys, doing port strikes, obviously, and some of and naval strikes and things like that. Especially as radar technology gets better, and and you get better things like air-launched torpedoes and stuff like that, where they're able to do a lot of damage to ships, and they're also able to locate ships in a province and actually hit them. In the early game, you may have a little bit of difficulty hitting ships in the open seas with naval bombers because they're just not able to find their targets, basically. But they're a very useful unit. As compared to carrier air groups. Carrier air groups don't do as much damage to ships and don't sink as many ships, don't sink as many subs, don't sink as many convoys. But naval bombers are limited by they have to be used from land-based airfields. So if you're playing, say, as the United Kingdom, your naval bombers will be able to operate, on the coast of France, or say to strike Italian ports, or Italian ships in the sea. And the same goes for Germany. Germany will use naval bombers to sink British shipping in the North Sea or in the Bay of Biscay. But when your convoys are getting hit out here by submarines, for example, as the UK, you're gonna if you want to use the Air Force to deal with that, you're gonna be better off using carrier air groups, because they can actually get to their targets. You're not necessarily gonna have access to air bases in the middle of the sea. So for countries that have a lot of convoys all over the place, aircraft carriers will be invaluable if you want to use the Air Force to deal with naval threats. Strategic bombers. Strategic bombers are your 4-engine aircraft. So you see here we've got this rather ridiculous Junkers. I don't think that's a Junkers plane. I'm not sure what plane that is, but there are there's 2 engines on each wing. That's a 4-engine bomber. Strategic bombers are not particularly good at hitting land units. They don't really do port strikes and naval strikes and things like that. They are particularly good at hitting provinces. So you're going to be using them for strategic bombing, which is leveling enemy IC. You're going to be using them for hitting infrastructure, logistical bombing. You're going to be using them for if you want to do runway cratering, so hitting enemy air bases, which affects the enemy's ability to repair aircraft, and yeah, that's pretty much it. You may also use them for installation strikes, although installation strikes are not that useful in this game. But basically, any province type, building type, any building type target falls under the strategic attack category. And so that's what these planes really excel at. Obviously, they're very expensive. They're very expensive, but I like them a lot actually. I find that they're very, very useful, and you may not be able to justify building them as Germany or maybe even the Soviet Union, but certainly the United States and I would argue the United Kingdom can make very, very good use of strategic bombers. Their ability to hit infrastructure and air bases in particular can really give you the edge in terms of air superiority. So perhaps if you're fighting Germany's fighters, for example, and you're finding that you're losing a lot of air battles, well, if you soften up the enemy's interceptor forces a bit or distract them by sending out some fighters, and then meanwhile you bomb their air bases. They won't be able to repair. So even if your fighters are not performing that well, you'll end up fighting against fighters that don't have any organization, don't have any strength. So very, very useful. They're also the longest range. They also have the longest range of all of the types of planes, although I think there's some techs here that are affecting the range of Germany, because I'm seeing actually multi-rolls here seem to have the longest range, so probably because Germany hasn't teched up any of these four-engine aircraft technologies. We will switch over to the United States at some point and look at that. There's one other kind of heavy aircraft that's neither a bomber or a fighter. That's transport planes. Transport planes have two functions. First of all, they have a very long range. Their range is similar to a little bit less than strategic bombers, so similar to tactical bombers. They are used for two functions. They are used to transport or paradrop paratroopers, and only paratroopers can load into transport planes. And they're also useful for air supply, so you can transfer supplies from an airbase province to any province on the map that's within their mission range, and they can be excellent for really supplying units over great distances. If you have a land unit that's cut off from its supply because it's been encircled or something like that, transport planes using air supply can actually be used to rescue that unit by providing it with supplies so that it can fight effectively until other land units are able to rescue it, basically. And so, I'll probably demonstrate that at a later point when I get into some of the specifics of combat and stuff like that. The flying bomb is a primitive rocket. Obviously, Germany developed a lot of these in the kind of when did they develop them? Maybe 42 or 43. Germany invested a lot in these in the war because they were essentially running out of pilots and running out of the industrial capacity to replenish the Luftwaffe as the British defeated them consistently, and the Soviets started to get their act together and have a much better, much stronger air force, and as the Americans joined the war, so they started manufacturing these fairly primitive but surprisingly effective rockets, because they don't have pilots. They don't have pilots, and they basically just they used very simple radar radio type sort of autopilot to strike strategic targets. The flying rocket is a more high-tech version of that, much faster, and I think longer range rockets. So these are interesting options, and these actually are quite effective. If you are playing as Germany, for example, you haven't successfully conquered the United Kingdom, and you're trying to focus on the Eastern Front, rather than put a bunch of your IC into strategic bombers, which could be better used perhaps on building more tanks for the Eastern Front. You can build a ton of flying bombs and eventually flying rockets, and just pummel the United Kingdom with flying rockets, because they don't really use up any manpower as they get destroyed. So you'll save on manpower and you'll save on IC by building these, and it's really interesting. It's a really interesting way to play the game, role play, and surprisingly effective for strategic attack. So that covers off all the different unit types. I think it's worth going through statistics here. A lot of these statistics overlap with the land units. They behave a little bit differently when you have air units, but they are essentially very similar. Organization is the same in the sense that when an aircraft loses its organization, it will flee from combat. Air combat does play out a little differently than land combat in terms of how long the engagements last, and I will do a video on air combat. I'll do maybe even several videos on different strategies for gaining air superiority and bombing the enemy, and and what the most effective ways to do that are. But suffice to say, their organization is essentially the same stat as it is for land units and to some degree naval units. Soft attack applies primarily to bombers. By the way, I didn't mention this, but interceptors are able to bomb units as are rocket interceptors. So you can use them as bombers. They're just not very good. Soft attack is good for hitting soft targets. Hard attack is good for hitting hard targets, as I mentioned, particularly close air support. You can see that tactical bombers can do a little bit of hard attack as well, but not very effective. Sea attack is good for hitting ships. So you can see that naval bombers, but also close air support, carrier air groups have decent sea attack. Tactical bombers are not really specialized at that. Air attack is the most important skill for defeating enemy air forces in the air. And as I mentioned, you can see here very quickly that interceptors trump multi-roles, which trump rocket interceptors, which trump carrier air groups. Strategic attack is the ability of air units to hit ground targets. So we can see here that the rockets have very, very high strategic attack, so bombing IC with them is going to be very effective. But yeah, this is for hitting IC, hitting infrastructure, hitting air bases, and it's very, 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 very effective. Some people are a little bit confused about the missions. I'll look through the missions quickly. In the bombing missions, some people think that strategic bombers are only for strategic bombing. Strategic bombing, logistical bombing, and runway cratering are all, and as well as installation strikes and port strikes, all fall under the strategic attack category. Port strikes, of course, are a little bit different because what you really want to do is hit hit the naval targets in the ports. So you can use strategic bombers, I think, to do. I'm not sure if you can use strategic bombers for port strikes. I actually don't think you can. But port strikes, you're more interested in the naval. Attack statistic, where but for strategic bombing, logistical bombing, runway cratering, and installation strike are the effectiveness of those strikes and the amount of damage they're going to do is going to be affected by this strategic attack statistic. Surface defense and air defense. These statistics are unfortunately broken, and that's these. I'm pretty sure. I'm not positive about air defense, but what they're supposed to do, surface defense is supposed to protect you from land-based anti-aircraft, so the anti-aircraft brigades that would be attached to infantry or other divisions, the provincial anti-aircraft guns as well. This is supposed to mitigate the damage that those will do to planes' org and strength. But as it turns out, these statistics are actually broken. I think some of the math that was put in place to implement them is broken and hard-coded, and unfortunately can't be fixed by mods either. Air defense. Air defense is supposed to limit the damage done by, if your multi-roles are fighting other multi-roles or whatever, it's supposed to limit the damage done there. Air defense also doesn't work. So that's it. The defensiveness statistics for aircraft, you can pretty safely ignore them. Unfortunately, that has multi-role fighters were supposed to have very high air defense. That has the effect of nerfing multi-roles a little bit, which is unfortunate. Surface detection is largely used for hitting ships It basically increases the degree to which bombers find their targets, and you need to find your targets in order to hit anything. Right, so even if they're very good, they have very good sea attack. If their surface detection is poor, they won't tend to actually find targets in sea provinces. I believe it's also used to detect land targets. Yeah, it's also used to detect land targets. But land targets are easier to detect in general, so it's not quite as big a deal. But still a reasonably important stat. Air detection. Air detection is an important stat. Air detection will increase the likelihood of your fighters actually engaging the enemy. So even if you're patrolling over an area, your fighters will not always find enemy bombers or enemy fighters when they're patrolling an area. So the higher their air detection is, the more likely they are to actually make contact with those fighters. So that is an important stat. Transport capability is a stat that applies to transport planes. Generally, you can pretty much ignore this stat. This is max mission range. That's pretty self-explanatory. It determines. If we go to the air map mode here, we can see that when planes are located on our own territory, we can see the max mission range. So you can see that some of these bombers have a much wider range. And then what the hell's going on here? Oh yeah, this is one of these silly rocket interceptors that has a very short range. So yeah, and those ranges increase with technology. Speed is a very important statistic. Speed is very important in the air. If an interceptor, so interceptors have a great deal of difficulty intercepting the flying rockets. You can see here that actually the German interceptors at the moment will be able to intercept the flying bombs, but it's very unlikely to be able to intercept something like a flying rocket because it has, it's 5,000 kilometers per hour is the speed. So that's the one advantage that rocket interceptors have. They'll be very hard to intercept. They're just not that good though. So increasing the speed of your aircraft is a very important thing in terms of technology, and will give you an edge. It will, if you have a high enough air attack so that you're able to win air battles, you're going to need your speed to be high enough to catch the enemy. Let's talk about the cost of the sort of cost of these units, which these statistics are going to show. So just like land units, aircraft have supply, and obviously, essentially, the heavier aircraft use more supplies. It looks like rocket interceptors also use a lot of supplies. The flying bomb and flying rockets use very few supplies, so that's another advantage of them. Fuel consumption, once again, the heavier aircrafts have a high fuel consumption, so your fuel consumption will also increase as you increase generally the engines and speed of your planes. Over the course of the war, planes will consume more fuel. Officers. Aircraft do not actually use officers, which is a little bit weird. It's a little bit weird, but that's one thing to keep in consideration when I talked about the your division composition, and I mentioned that it's worthwhile to think about how much leadership you have, because you need officers to keep the organization of your units up. If you don't have if you don't have 140% here, you'll get a penalty to organization for all of your units. But air units actually don't don't consume officers, so, which is strange. I don't understand why they would choose to do that way. So as a result, though, if you are short on leadership, building a large air force might be a good option. If you have lots of IC but not a lot of leadership, building lots of aircraft might actually be not such a bad idea. However, they're very expensive. Most aircraft are fairly expensive in terms of IC. So right now, it's kind of strange because again Germany hasn't upgraded their strategic bombers, but the bigger planes tend to cost more IC, and you've got build time here as well. So this is a bit misleading. The transport plane takes up more IC, but it doesn't take nearly as much time to build, so it's actually cheaper than the strategic bomber, even though it looks more expensive here. So remember, you got to look at both the IC and the build time, which you can also see down here. Manpower. As I mentioned last video, aircraft do take up manpower. They don't take up very much. So, doing things like, building close air support to supplement your army may very well be a good idea for some countries that have limited limited manpower. It may very well be a good idea to build a larger air force. However, when you're playing as smaller countries, things like transport planes, 4 manpower starts to be a little bit prohibitive, especially when you consider that your paratrooper divisions are probably going to take something like 9 manpower, right? So worth keeping in mind, especially for these bigger 4-engine planes. So that pretty much covers air statistics. Let's hop over to the United States now. How do we organize our air units, though? So when you load up one of these scenarios, in the 1936 scenario is included in this. When you load up one of these scenarios, you may find that the AI likes to mix fighters and bombers. With a few exceptions, it's almost never a good idea to mix fighters and bombers in the same stack. So if you want, for the most effective air defense, you want to isolate your bombers from your interceptors. Even though I said that multi-roles can escort bombers, with a few exceptions, you don't really want to be mixing them in with tactical bombers, and there's a reason for that. The reason for that is that certain aircraft are better at certain missions. However, one air stack like this can only be on one mission at a time. So when your interceptors are, if your multi-roles or your interceptors are escorting a tactical bomber, and the tactical bomber is doing a ground attack, the multi-roles are doing a ground attack at the same time, so they're not getting the mission efficiency stats, which you get from your doctrines. They're not getting their better mission efficiency for the type of mission that they're doing. They're not going to get an intercept efficiency, so they will tend to lose their air battles and do a bad job of bombing. So they just undermine the whole operation. So keep your fighters and bombers separately and use them independently. And in terms of how many air units should be in a stack, this is actually perfect. 3 is pretty much ideal. As you get above 4 or 5, you start to get stacking penalties, and so generally speaking, though, 3 is pretty much the optimal stack. Partly because of the way that aircraft target each other in the air, it's a bit of a weird bug. But this will be the most effective at avoiding stacking penalties and at intercepting. Obviously, you're going to want to keep an eye on the strength and organization. If the strength of this unit is completely depleted, just like a land-based division, if a division is totally depleted, it will shatter. But even if one of these is depleted, it will completely shatter, and you'll lose it, and you'll have to build it again from the production interface, and that takes time. So you don't really want to have these units getting shattered. In terms of bombers, like I said, generally should be kept separate. In terms of bombers, it's actually not such a bad idea to stack huge numbers of them. Typically, your bombers are not going to be fighting in the air anyway. So, making quite large stacks of maybe 5 or 6 tactical bombers is not such a bad idea. It's not such a bad idea. Strategic bombers as well. You can. To be honest, this 10 stack of strategic bombers. I mean, my God, you would just wreak havoc on the enemy with this, and they would be super long range. Let's take a look at their range. Yeah, I mean, they're so long range, and this is why the flying rockets and flying bombs are of limited utility. As Germany, you will be able to hit targets in England, but you're going to be limited basically to the south of England, more or less. Whereas, as the United States, you'll be able to deploy strategic bombers from an airbase in England and hit targets basically all the way to Berlin. by the end of the war. Your range will be just so huge. Keep in mind, if you mix units with the other reason why you don't tend to want to mix air units is that if I mix in multi-rolls with these strategic bombers, it will reduce their range. They use the range of the lowest range units. I believe they may also use the speed of the slowest speed unit as well. So obviously strategic bombers are much slower, and they can't escape as well. So anyway, basically the takeaway is don't mix fighters and bombers because it dilutes the statistics of both units. There is one exception to that rule, one notable exception to that rule, and that is naval bombers. I'm trying to find it. Does the US even have naval bombers? They must. I would also not do this. Don't mix interceptors and multi-rolls. Interceptors are better. This is a bad stack. This is again one of these silly AI stacks, but this is a bad stack because the interceptor is better at air combat. The multi-roll has a much wider range, so you're limiting the range of the interceptor and you're diluting the ability of the interceptor to do its job. You're also limiting the ability of the multi-roll to operate in longer ranges. All right, here's a naval bomber. Oh man, they don't have any of those mixed stacks. So naval bombers can be mixed actually with multi-roll fighters because they have a very similar range. The multi-roll might slightly diminish the ability of the naval bombers to actually hit and damage ships, but if you're using them, for example, for convoy raiding, the multi-roll will make the naval bomber a little bit less vulnerable to enemy air attacks, and so you'll be able to do a little bit more convoy raiding. I actually tend to use them in isolation, though. I tend to use the two naval bombers and multi-rolls separately. So generally speaking, just don't mix them. In terms of transport planes, you could, if you want, mix transport planes with, say, a multi-roll fighter to escort it. That would certainly, I think overall, that would probably make it less likely for your transport planes to take a beating when they're, say, dropping paratroopers. But I think ultimately, I think your fighters are not going to be able to fight that well because their statistics are going to be diluted by the transport plane statistics. But you get the general sense. Keep your air units separate. Keep your area units separate and build separate stacks. Here we have a flying bomb. It looks like we don't have any of the flying rockets actually on the map here. I don't think so. But you've got these flying bombs, and you can see their range is very limited, right? I think the flying rockets would be able to hit London, maybe, but these flying bombs are really only able to hit if we put them in Cherbourg, although Germany's not going to have control of Cherbourg very long there. If we put them in Cherbourg, they might be able to hit some of the IC in southern England. But very effective at strategic bombing, but they have a limited range. So if you can get, you could also build an airbase there. If you want to basically spam these because they're so cheap to build, cheap and fast to build. If you want to spam them and just launch them constantly at London and places like that, you could actually do a lot of damage to the United Kingdom that way. Destroy a lot of their IC. One thing to keep in mind is that even though these are flying bombs, so obviously when you launch a bomb, it goes off. When it lands, it doesn't come back. Think of these as like a production line of flying bombs. So you don't actually need to build more than one or two. One approach to using, every time they hit their target, their strength goes way down. You can actually let these units repair and then just use them again, and that's an abstraction of like a factory producing flying bombs. So you can almost think of these flying bomb units as a flying bomb factory rather than an actual literal flying bomb. One other thing I didn't mention is the way that nukes work in this game. I highly doubt that even the United States has nukes because of the strangeness of this scenario. No. Do they even have any nuclear reactors? I have no idea. But they should. There should be like a nuclear reactor down here by 1944, I think. The way that nukes work is once you once you get this civil nuclear research up and you build your first nuclear reactor, the more nuclear reactors you have on the map, this number will simply increase on its own. You don't build nukes in the production interface. The more nuclear reactors you have, the faster you accumulate nukes. And as soon as you have one nuke, when you select a strategic bomber unit, I'm pretty sure it has to be a strategic bomber. When you select a strategic bomber unit and you click on a province, the nuclear strike option will appear here. So that's how nukes work. Obviously, nukes are not something that make much of an appearance in the game. You can use them to basically win the war at the end of the game. It's sort of a win button to a certain degree because it does a huge amount of damage to the enemy's national unity. Yeah, so you are able to nuke enemies in this game. So that covers off the Air Force.